The barn smelled of old hay and something older, iron, oil, and the particular silence of things that have been waiting a long time. Dominic Reeves stepped through the gap in the sliding door and stopped. He was dressed for a different kind of afternoon. Charcoal wool, Italian leather, a watch that cost more than most people's cars. He looked around the interior with the measured contempt of a man who had made his fortune deciding what was worth keeping and what was not. Then he saw it. The Porsche sat in the far corner beneath a canvas tarp that had partially slid from its frame, exposing a crumpled front quarter panel, a shattered headlamp housing, and a windscreen cracked across its full width. The body was the color of old bone, where it wasn't rust-spotted, and the roof had been compressed on the driver's side in a way that suggested serious impact. Reeve walked toward it slowly, the way a man walks toward something he has already decided is worthless. He lifted one edge of the tarp, let it fall, and turned to the man standing quietly near the workbench. "You paid money for this," he said. Not a question. He said it the way people say things they find faintly ridiculous, with a soft breath at the end that was almost a laugh. "It's scrap. Whatever you think you're going to do with it, you won't." What Reeve did not know was that the man standing near the workbench had once rebuilt a 917 from a crate of loose components for a client in Stuttgart, that his name appeared in the acknowledgments of 2 Porsche factory restoration manuals, and that the car in the corner was something Reeve had no framework to recognize at all. Stay with this one to the end. Every detail matters. The man near the workbench was named Daniel Voss. He was 39 years old, and he had the hands of someone who had been working with metal since before he could legally drive. He did not answer Reeve immediately. He set down the caliper he had been holding, wiped his palm on a cloth that had been gray for a long time, and looked at the car the way he always looked at things that needed his attention, steadily, without hurry, the way you look at something you already understand. He had not always worked in a barn. For 11 years, Daniel had run a specialist restoration workshop in a converted building outside Ludwigsburg, in the Swabian Hills south of Stuttgart, where the air in spring smelled of pine resin and diesel, and the kind of cold that clears your head. The workshop had no sign above the door. It did not need one. His clients found him through other clients, a collector in Geneva, a museum curator in Maranello, a racing family in Modena whose grandfather had run at Le Mans. He had held a factory certification from Porsche AG since the age of 28. He had 3 patents in his name, all related to stress fracture analysis in aluminum alloy panels. He did not advertise. He did not have a website. He charged fairly, and the cars that left his workshop were not restored in the cosmetic sense, but returned to something precise and original and entirely themselves. Then Claire died. She had been a structural engineer, and she had been 34, and the aneurysm had come on a Tuesday morning in March, when their daughter Mia was 4 years old. There was no long decline, no preparation, no conversation about what came next. There was a Tuesday, and then there was everything after it. Daniel spent 6 months in Ludwigsburg trying to continue, And then he understood that he could not be in Germany and be present for Mia at the same time. The workshop required him entirely. Mia required him more. He sold the Ludwigsburg property, packed the tools that mattered into a shipping container, and returned to the valley in eastern Tennessee, where his grandfather had farmed, where there was a barn with good bones and a house with a porch, and where Mia could grow up knowing one parent was always there. He had been in Tennessee for 3 years when Dominic Reeve walked into the barn. Mia was ucking now. She carried everywhere a small stuffed rabbit named Arlo, who had one ear reattached with a careful hand stitch and whose left eye was a replacement button, slightly larger than the original. She had watched her father work since she was old enough to sit on a stool without falling off, and she had developed opinions about cars the way some children develop opinions about birds or dinosaurs, with complete seriousness and no sense that this was unusual. She was not in the barn that afternoon. She was at school, where she spent her days with the focused attention of a child who had learned early that attention was something you gave to things that deserved it. The Porsche in the corner was a 1966 911. Daniel had acquired it through a private contact in Knoxville, whose estate had included it among machinery the family had no knowledge of and no interest in keeping. The car had sat covered for 53 years, since the estate's original owner, a man named Harlan Pruitt, had driven it off from a country road in 1971 and decided the repair was more trouble than he could manage. The damage was real. The front end had taken a significant impact. The driver's door was seized in its frame, and the engine had not turned over in half a century. But the body was fundamentally intact beneath the damage. The chassis had not been compromised at the rails, and the interior, though cracked and faded, was original in every detail. What Daniel had seen when he first pulled back that tarp was not a wreck. It was a problem with a solution. He had bought it for $4,000, which was either a great deal or a reasonable one, depending entirely on what you knew. Dominic Reeve did not know what Daniel knew. Reeve was the chief executive of a regional commercial real estate firm called Apex Land Holdings, and he had come to the valley because he was assembling parcels for a development project, and Daniel's property sat at the edge of a tract he wanted. He had stopped at the barn because the door was open, and because Reeve was the kind of man who stopped at open doors, who believed that everything he encountered was potentially useful to him, and nothing was beyond his assessment. He had a way of moving through spaces as if he were already deciding what they would become. He was not a cruel man exactly. He was a man who had learned that certainty is a form of authority and who had never been made to question that lesson. He looked at the crumpled Porsche once more before he left. "You should cut your losses," he said, and walked back out into the afternoon light. Daniel watched him go. He did not say anything. He picked up the caliper and went back to work. The winter that followed was the kind the valley got once every several years. Persistent, iron gray, with a cold that settled into the barn floor and stayed. Daniel worked in a canvas jacket and wool-lined gloves with the fingertips cut away, and the barn light threw long shadows across the concrete as he moved around the car with the patience of someone who had learned that patience was not a virtue, but a technique. He had called his old colleague, Rafe Okoro, in the second week of December. Rafe had worked with Daniel in Ludwigsburg for 6 years and had since been running his own small shop in Asheville, 2 hours east. He arrived on a Friday morning in a truck that was older than most of his tools, said nothing beyond a greeting, put on a work jacket, and began. He did not ask about the fee. There was no fee discussed. This was the kind of friendship that does not require that conversation. On day 3, they pulled the engine. A 2.0-liter flat 6. The original unit, still in the car after 53 years. Rafe held the flashlight while Daniel examined the case for cracks, moving the beam slowly across each surface with the methodical care of a man reading a document he expects to be important. The case was sound. The camshaft journals were worn, but not beyond specification. The cylinders would need new liners, the pistons were seized, and the carburetors had corroded beyond cleaning, but the fundamental architecture was intact and original. "It'll run," Daniel said. Rafe said, "I know." Mia came to the barn on Saturdays, sitting on her stool with Arlo in her lap, watching the work with the focused attention she brought to everything. On the 4th Saturday, she looked at the stripped engine on the stand and said, "It looks like it's waiting." Daniel looked up. "What do you mean?" "Like it knows it's going to run again," she said, "and it's just waiting." He did not answer immediately. He looked at the engine for a moment, and then he went back to work. But she was not wrong. By day 11, the front quarter panel had been removed, and the structural damage assessed in full. The subframe had taken a crease at the left front corner, not a fracture, but a controlled deformation, the kind that could be returned to specification with the right equipment and the right hands. Daniel had a hydraulic frame straightener that had come with him from Ludwigsburg in the shipping container. It was not the kind of equipment you found in a barn in eastern Tennessee. It was the kind you found in factory-certified restoration facilities in Stuttgart and Modena. On day 14, they began the straightening process. It took 4 sessions over 2 days, each measured against a factory chassis specification sheet from an archive Daniel had assembled over 15 years of working with Porsche AG. Each measurement was recorded in a notebook with a mechanical pencil, in a hand that was small and precise. The work was not dramatic. It was deliberate. The kind of work that does not announce itself. On day 19, Rafe found something under the rear bumper valance, hidden by 50 years of grime and old undercoating. He called Daniel over without raising his voice, which was how Rafe called you when something mattered. He was holding a flashlight at a low angle. and in the beam, stamped into the metal of the rear panel in the factory convention of the era, was a sequence of characters that Daniel read once, then again, then stood up straight and was still for a long moment. It was a competition preparation code, a specific one, the kind that appeared on cars built or prepared by the factory for sanctioned racing events. Daniel had seen it before, in documentation, in photographs, in the provenance records of cars that had sold at auction for figures that required a second look. He had never seen it on a car he was standing next to in a barn in Tennessee. He photographed the stamp twice from different angles, then stood back and looked at the whole car, in pieces around the barn, with an expression that was not excitement exactly. It was the expression of a man who has been reading a document carefully and has arrived at a passage that changes the meaning of everything before it. "Rafe," he said finally. "I see it," Rafe said. Daniel opened his laptop and navigated to a private archive maintained by a historian named Georg Baumann, who had spent 30 years documenting the factory competition cars of the 1960s. He entered the code. The result came back in 11 seconds. The car matched a chassis listed in Baumann's registry as one of 4 factory-supported cars prepared for the 1966 Targa Florio, the Sicilian road race that wound through 44 miles of mountain road and was, by most measures, the most technically demanding motorsport event in the world at the time. The chassis had been listed as unaccounted for since 1969. Daniel sat with that for a moment. Then he closed the laptop and went back to work. The aluminum number plate was still attached to the car, hidden beneath the tarp and the crumpled bodywork, and 50 years of disregard. It was a stamped plate bearing the race number and event designation in the raised lettering of the period, dented and oxidized but legible. It was, in its way, the most important object in the barn. Daniel did not remove it. He cleaned it carefully with a soft cloth and left it where it was. Dominic Reeve returned to the property in February, 6 weeks after his first visit. He came with a revised land offer and an associate named Preston, who carried a folder and said very little. Reeve walked into the barn with the same proprietary ease as before and stopped when he saw how much had changed. The car was further along, the front end reassembled, the body stripped to bare metal, the engine back in the car and turning over on a temporary fuel supply. The barn smelled of fresh metal and solvent, and the warmth of a space where serious work had been happening for weeks. "Still at it," Reeves said, with the faint amusement of a man who has decided the joke is still running. "I hope you know what you're doing." Daniel was adjusting the carburetor linkage with a long-handled screwdriver. He did not look up. "I do," he said. Preston stood near the door with his folder and looked at the car with an expression different from Reeves. Preston was 26, had studied business at Vanderbilt, but had grown up in a family that collected vintage European automobiles, and he knew what a factory competition stamp looked like. He had seen the plate when he walked in. He had seen the stamp on the rear panel, still visible in the shop light. He said nothing, because Reeve was already talking about the land offer, and because Preston had learned that there were moments when the wisest thing was to be very quiet and look carefully. He looked carefully. He did not yet know the full story, but he knew enough to understand that something in this barn was not what his employer believed it to be. The proof arrived not as a single event, but as a sequence of confirmations, each one quieter than the last, each one more certain. Georg Baumann was 71 years old and lived in a narrow house in Zuffenhausen, 2 streets from the Porsche factory, surrounded by filing cabinets and the particular smell of old paper and photographic developer that accumulates in the homes of men who have spent their lives preserving what others discarded. He had been corresponding with Daniel for 9 years. He had reviewed provenance claims on 43 cars in that time and rejected 31 of them. He was not a man who confirmed things easily. Daniel had sent him the photographs on a Sunday evening in late February. The stamp, the plate, the chassis measurements cross-referenced against the factory specification sheet, and undercoating samples a materials laboratory in Knoxville had dated to a range consistent with 1965 to 1968. A short covering note said only that he had found something and wanted Baumann to look before he said anything further. Baumann's reply came 11 days later. 4 pages, single-spaced, in German, on the letterhead of the Porsche Museum's historical archive. Daniel read it at the workbench on a Wednesday morning while Mia was at school with a cup of coffee going cold beside him. He read it once through without stopping, then set it down, then picked it up and read it again. Baumann had cross-referenced the competition stamp against his own registry, the factory-build records assembled from production ledgers, and the race entry documentation from the 1966 Targa Florio held in his personal archive. The chassis number matched. The stamp was consistent with factory competition preparation codes issued in that period. The plate corresponded to the entry designation for one of the 4 factory-supported cars that had run in the 1966 race. Baumann noted that the chassis had been listed as unaccounted for since 1969, when it last appeared in a private sale record in Naples. He did not speculate about how it had reached a barn in Tennessee. He stated what the evidence showed and signed his name to it. At the bottom of the letter, in a postscript written in slightly different ink, Baumann had added 1 sentence in English. "I would very much like to see it when it is ready." Daniel folded the letter and put it in the workbench drawer where he kept documents that mattered. Then he finished his coffee and went back to work. The engine ran for the first time on day 31. It was a Wednesday afternoon, cold and clear, with the barn door open to let the exhaust clear, and Rafe standing to one side with his arms crossed, and his expression composed, in the way of a man who has done this before but has not stopped finding it significant. The flat 6 turned over twice, caught, and settled into the uneven idle of an engine, winding itself. How? Daniel made 3 adjustments to the carburetor mixture over the next 20 minutes, each one measured against the sound of the engine rather than a gauge. Because there is a point in this kind of work where the instrument is the ear and nothing else. By the end of the hour, the idle was even, quiet, mechanical, correct. Mia was there that afternoon, still wearing her backpack, Arlo tucked under one arm. She stood near the barn door and listened. And after a while, she said, "It sounds like it remembered." Rafe looked at her. He did not say anything, but the corner of his mouth moved. Daniel made a note in the notebook. The engine ran. The date. The time. The idle speed. By day 44, the car was complete. Not finished in the sense of polished and presented, but complete in the sense Daniel used the word. Everything returned to its correct state. Every system functioning within factory specification. Every surface treated according to the methods of the period. The body had been repainted in the original shade, a color designated in the factory records as polo red, mixed to the original formula from pigment stocks sourced from a specialist supplier in Munich. The front quarter panel had been replaced with a period-correct unit from a private contact in the Netherlands. The windscreen was new glass, cut to original specification. The interior had been cleaned and conditioned, but not reupholstered, because the original leather, though cracked and faded, was authentic, and authenticity in this kind of work was not a preference, but a discipline. The aluminum number plate remained where it had always been. Daniel had cleaned it. He had not restored it. It bore the marks of a race run in the mountains of Sicily in 1966, and those marks were part of what it was. He photographed the finished car on a Saturday morning, barn doors open, winter's light coming in flat and even from the east. 41 photographs, each documenting a specific aspect from a specific angle in the manner of a factory inspection record. He sent them to Bauman with a short note. Bauman responded within a day and said he would come in March. He came on the 14th on a direct flight from Stuttgart to Knoxville. And Daniel drove the 40 minutes to collect him. Bauman was a small man with white hair and the careful posture of someone who had spent decades bending over documents. He said very little on the drive back except to remark that the hills were not unlike the Swabian hills. He walked into the barn and stood in front of the car for a long time without speaking. He walked around it once, slowly, stopping at the rear to examine the competition stamp with a magnifying glass from his jacket pocket. He crouched to look at the underside of the rear valance. He opened the driver's door and examined the door cart, the sill plate, and the floor without touching anything. He looked at the number plate for a long time. Then he stood up, put the magnifying glass away, and said, in German, "Yes." That was all he said for several minutes. Then in English, "I will write the certificate this week. You will have it before the end of the month." He flew back to Stuttgart the following morning. The certificate arrived on the 22nd of March by registered mail on the letterhead of the Porsche Museum's historical archive. 2 pages. It identified the chassis number, the competition preparation code, the race entry designation, and the provenance chain as established by Bauman's research. It stated in the formal language of historical authentication that the vehicle was one of 4 factory-supported cars prepared for and entered in the 1966 Targa Florio, and that it was the only one of the 4 whose current location and condition had been confirmed. Signed by Bauman and countersigned by the director of the archive department. Daniel read it at the kitchen table, with Mia doing her homework across from him, her pencil moving in the focused silence she brought to numbers. He read it twice. Then he folded it, put it back in the envelope, and asked Mia if she wanted help with her fractions. She said she did not. She said she almost had it. He made dinner. The certificate was the proof. External, institutional, verifiable. It did not depend on Daniel's word or his knowledge or his 11 years in Ludwigsburg. It depended on Georg Bauman's 30 years of documented research and the institutional authority of the Porsche Museum's archive. And it said in the precise language of historical record that the car in the barn was not scrap. It was not a wreck. It was a 1966 Targa Florio factory entry, one of 4, the only one accounted for. Daniel placed the certificate in the drawer with Bauman's letter. He did not make any calls. He went back to work on a set of SU carburetors for a client in Nashville, and the barn settled back into its usual quiet, and the Porsche sat in the corner under the new shop light, polo red and correct and still. It did not have to wait long. Dominic Reeve returned on the last Thursday of March. He came alone without Preston, without a folder. He had called ahead, which he had not done before, and it said on the phone that he wanted to discuss the land offer again, that there was flexibility in the terms he had not previously mentioned. His voice had been measured, which was also different from before. Daniel said he could come by in the afternoon. Reeve arrived at 2:30. The light was good, the kind of late March afternoon light that comes in low and clear and finds every surface. He walked into the barn and stopped in the doorway, and for a moment, he did not say anything at all. The Porsche sat in the center of the barn floor, where Daniel had moved it to complete the final detailing. It was the color of a deep, saturated red, the kind of red that does not shout but insists, and in the afternoon light it was not the crumpled, rust-spotted object Reeve had seen in January. It was something else entirely. A car that had been somewhere and done something and had come back to itself, and the barn light fell across it in a way that made the aluminum number plate catch and hold. Reeve walked toward it slowly. He stopped when he reached the number plate and looked at it for a long moment. He was a man who had spent his career assessing the value of things, and he was looking at the plate the way he looked at things. He was trying to understand quickly. The plate bore the race number and the event designation in the raised lettering of the period, and the event designation read clearly and without ambiguity, Targa Florio, 1966. Something happened in Reeves' face, not dramatic. The kind of change that happens when a man who has been certain discovers, in a single quiet moment, that his certainty was the problem. His jaw did not drop. He did not step back. He simply went still, the way people go still, when their internal model of a situation requires rapid revision, and for a moment the barn was very quiet. He looked at Daniel, who was standing near the workbench with a cloth in his hand, watching without expression. "This is a Targa Florio car," Reeves said. Not a question this time either. But nothing like the last time he had said something that was not a question in this barn. His voice had changed register entirely. Careful now. The voice of a man choosing words with the awareness that the wrong ones would cost him something. Daniel said, "It is." Reeve crossed to the rear panel and crouched to examine the competition stamp, the way Bauman had crouched, though without the magnifying glass. He stood up slowly. "I said something when I was here in January," he said. He paused. "It was unkind, and it was wrong." Daniel did not respond to that. He folded the cloth and set it on the workbench. Reeve turned to face him fully. "I'd like to talk about the car. I have relationships with 2 auction houses that handle significant collector vehicles. I think I know what this could bring, properly presented with documentation." Daniel looked at the car for a moment. Then he looked at Reeve. "I'll think about it," he said. Reeve nodded. He understood, or seemed to, that this was not a negotiating position. It was a complete answer. He looked at the car one more time, and then he walked back out into the afternoon light, and the barn door swung gently behind him, and the sound of his car on the gravel road faded into the quiet of the valley. Daniel stood in the barn for a moment after Reeve left. He did not feel anything he would have called triumph. He felt the particular stillness that comes at the end of a long and careful piece of work, when the thing you set out to do has been done correctly, and the world has confirmed it, and there is nothing left to prove. He turned off the shop light above the Porsche and left the car in the softer light from the barn's western window, and he went inside to start dinner. Mia was at the kitchen table, Arlo on the chair beside her, her school book open to a page about rivers. She looked up when he came through the door. "Is the car finished?" "Yes," he said. She considered this with the seriousness she brought to everything. "Did the man understand it?" she asked. Daniel thought about that. "He does now," he said. She nodded as though this was the expected outcome, and went back to her rivers. He made dinner. He washed the dishes. He helped Mia with the parts of her homework. She asked for help because, and he did not help with the parts she did not ask about, because she had her mother's precision and her mother's stubbornness about working things through herself. And he had learned to respect that. He carried her to bed at 8:30, Arlo tucked under her arm, and he stood in the doorway of her room for a moment after she was settled, making sure the world was still in its correct order. Then he walked back through the house and out to the porch, and the garage light was on above the barn's door, throwing a yellow rectangle across the gravel, and the valley was dark and quiet in every direction, and the hills were the same hills they had always been. He stood there for a while. Not long. Long enough. There are things in this world that go unseen for decades because no one looked at them long enough, or carefully enough, or with the right kind of knowledge behind their eyes. Most of them stay unseen. A few find their way to someone who knows how to look. The looking is the work. It always was. Daniel went inside. The garage light stayed on.